Hey everybody, welcome to Downballot Roundup in partnership with Leave No Dems Behind, where I introduce you to Democratic candidates running in local elections throughout the country. I'm Bryan Randolph, and I'm here today with Angela Choberka, who is running for the Utah House of Representatives to represent the Ninth District. Hello, Angela. It is wonderful to meet you.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Great to have you on. Why don't you start by telling us just a little bit about you?
You bet. Well, Brian, I've been, throughout my career, I have been looking at healthcare and education disparities. And in the beginning of my career, I was actually a public school teacher in Brooklyn. And then I've lived in Utah for about 20 years, and I've been serving on the Ogden City Council for the past 6.5 years. I'm in my second term, and I'm very excited to run for this House seat to help get more representation up there in the House.
Excellent. And can you tell me a little bit about your district?
You bet. Well, it's a very interesting district because in Utah we've had a supermajority Republicans for quite a while. So one of the challenges is my district actually covers a part of downtown Ogden where I live and currently represent another kind of urban area and then a huge rural area that has actually seen a big changes that have happened over the past few years with growth. You know, it used to be a lot of fields, farmhouses, fields, ranches, and now it's becoming very, very populated with all different types of housing. And so there's a lot of growth challenges there. But we are a very diverse community. Honestly, Weber County is one of the more diverse communities that we have in Utah, which sometimes people don't realize because they kind of think we are a majority white population. However, in these different areas, especially urban central areas, we have a very diverse populations.
Now, speaking of districts, I know that in 2018, Utah's Prop 4 required an independent redistricting commission to redraw the district maps, which was opposed by Republicans at the time, but did barely succeed. What effect is that having right now?
Well, let me tell you, it's been a huge controversy. So, number one, during that time, we did actually have kind of an advisory outside commission that was running, but at the same time, the legislature, which is a supermajority, again, Republicans, they ran their own process. And in the end, they followed their own recommendations versus that outside entity. And so there's been lawsuits. So, recently, the Utah Supreme Court actually ruled that process unconstitutional. So now, over the next couple of years, we're very hopeful that we'll actually get some actually objective redistricting that will happen because much like the district I just described to you of mine, there are many others that are very similar. And you can see that people were definitely not being objective when they created those districts.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when you're out in those districts, what are you hearing from people are the kind of bigger issues that they want dealt with?
Well, that is one of our big issues. I would have to say is that they're very different because we have the more inner city type folks, and they're dealing with issues in their city, maybe around growth, for example, housing solutions that only that city can really manage themselves. So in Ogden City, we have a totally built out city, pretty much old infrastructure. So we're doing a lot of redevelopment and have different initiatives in that way. Whereas West Haven, as I mentioned before, this big rural area, I mean, they're just building new housing and building that kind of infrastructure. But the big challenge they have is they don't have a grocery store. So it's a huge swath of land that was rural at one time, and they have to come back to more of the inner city to actually do their grocery shopping. So it's some of those things that are really challenging that are causing people these pain points in their life, right? Like you might get a little bit more land and a more affordable house living out in West Haven, but then you have to figure out how you're going to be connecting with all those resources.
Yeah. Um, and is there a particular part of that? I mean, do you have a particular policy initiative that you would want to deal with if you were to take this spot in the State House?
Absolutely. Well, number one, I would just say we can't have one policy that fits all. And I think that's one perspective that the legislature is kind of using now to solve some of these issues like housing, getting more housing developed, is they have like a one size fits all kind of plan. And so you really have to work with the local entities. And that's something that I have experience doing in the Ogden City Council, but also in my community work for my day job, thinking about how do we build these supports for families and students and people so that then they can thrive in their own way, have a really great livable wage that's close to home so you don't have to travel very far, and then also have housing that is quality and also affordable. And so I think that's the biggest important thing is to make those connections at the local with the local stakeholders and with the people to understand what their needs really are and then build out policy around that versus just create a policy that's kind of flat for everyone.
And do you have a spot where you and your opponent are really on the opposite sides of some of these issues?
Well, there's definitely some spots. For example, we were in a debate last week, and he brought up his stance around environmental issues and kind of aligning with the Republican Party and their more conservative stance. Number one, Republicans in this area don't even like to talk about climate change generally, but we do have John Curtis, who is a representative that has been talking about this a little bit more. But in that conversation, there was a really stark difference because my opponent was suggesting that he's really a believer in this reliance and self fulfilling kind of work to use up those natural resources, and that's what they're really there
Hmm.
for. Obviously, he mentioned he's a little bit younger, so he did mention I want to do it in the cleanest way possible. But that's a very different perspective than me, who I'm saying we are absolutely responsible as individuals, as industry, as government for how our environment is being impacted. We can see the crisis happening right now with the weather, but there's many other crises out here that we have to deal with, air quality being number one. We have really detrimental air quality a lot of times of year for different reasons. And there's things that we can do to address those directly versus saying, hey, well, we're just, those things are just going to happen.
And now, how far are you from Salt Lake?
We're about 35 minutes. Yeah, not too
Okay.
far.
Are you getting any of the air quality issues from the drying up of the lake and the air quality issues from that?
Yeah, we definitely would. Right now, the lake is doing okay because we've had a couple of wet years, but it's definitely an issue that's become more prevalent in the legislature, where you actually do hear Republicans even talking about this issue because they see maybe they see it more from their value of thinking about economic prosperity and how that will impact our recreation and other kinds of industry. But definitely an issue for us, especially as we think about the impacts that we could have. We have mountains that kind of surround us, and then we have the lake. So there's a lake effect that happens where, and it's a natural occurrence, of course, where we get this stagnant air that gets trapped in that basin. And so, in order to mitigate that, we certainly can have other policies that help to promote more green and sustainable energy or electricity versus depending on our resources like coal.
Okay, I want to get back to this gerrymandering issue for one moment, only
Yeah,
because I think you may have a really unique perspective on this that we don't usually hear, which is, often we talk about this in terms of whether or not people are being represented sort of to the left or the right. That the gerrymandering has been created to make sure that a particular group's voice is not heard. But interestingly, what I heard from you was the idea that by dividing um, that by creating this district that is kind of half inner city, half urban, they've created a situation where neither group gets to have its own issues heard, no matter what its political affiliation is. Is that?
it's
Would you say that?
true.
Is that a?
Yeah, a little bit. I also really believe that, especially in the northern region here, well, to be frank, outside of Salt Lake County, there's only one other Democratic representative at the state level. So that's certainly a challenge. And I think that a lot of times, even if there's the opportunity for other people to be elected, it is some of these people from the more rural areas because of the way it's been gerrymandered. It just works out that way. For example, my district is rated as an R plus 12, but I honestly don't believe that's actually the representation because I think after years and years and years of not feeling you have a voice or not having a viable candidate on the ballot, then people just disconnect. They figure, well, why should I get involved? Why should I even bother voting? Because it's not going to make any difference at all. And so that's one reason why I decided to run was I feel like I'm really well known in the community. People know the work I do. I'm running on a stance of running beyond divides. Of course, I stand up for things like reproductive rights, environmental issues, things like this that are definitely democratic values. But honestly, they cross all those lines. There's people that care about women's reproductive health that are not Democrats that are heavily impacted by the severe trigger law that we could have put in place if it's being held up right now in the Utah Supreme Court. But these issues are very important to people, and I feel like they have just kind of stepped back because they haven't had a viable choice on the ballot that could possibly beat this gerrymandering.
Okay, thank you. Now, all right, now we're at my last question, which is my favorite. Don't have a lot of time, but this I always ask this, and I call it my softball question. Could you tell me something about your district that makes it special to you?
Well, I love my district. Like I said, I've lived here about 20 years now, and I love it because we're actually the crossroads of the West. We are just south of the Golden Spike, where the Transcontinental Railroad met at one point, and it changed our country, of course, but also brought such great diversity to our region. Ogden was, we're actually still called Untamed because we were a little bit of the Wild West, but we also brought together all different cultures and all different people that brought great food, creativity, music, art, different things together. And I think we still hold that up, right? We still have a really wonderful community where we're not so big yet that people themselves can't get involved and make things happen. And so we really come together to make great things happen. And I think we often have that perspective too of a more broad perspective than maybe other places in Utah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Angela Choberka is running for the Utah State House for District 9. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I really, really wish you the best because I would like to see some more diversity come into the Utah State House. So that'd be great.
Me too.